Most powerful Muslim commander of the entire crusading era, the man who recaptured Jerusalem and humbled three European kings, spent more of his military career fighting other Muslims than he ever spent fighting Christians. A Shia caliphate in Cairo, threatened by his Sunni ambitions, quietly aligned with the Frankish lords of Jerusalem to slow him down. And in 1115 AD, a coalition of Muslim princes from Damascus, Aleppo, and Mardin joined forces with the Crusader states to defeat an invading Sunni army, because they feared their co-religionists more than they feared the men who held Jerusalem. The Holy War was real. The two sides were not. In 1095 AD, the year the Crusades began, three distinct worlds sat side by side around the eastern Mediterranean, and all three were in serious trouble. The Byzantine Empire, which had held the Christian East for 7 centuries, was hemorrhaging territory it could not recover. The Islamic world, once unified under a single caliphate, had shattered into rival dynasties that spent more energy fighting each other than any outside enemy. And Latin Europe, the world of popes and kings and restless knights, was tearing itself apart over a question it could not answer. Who, exactly, was in charge? Begin with Byzantium, because the Crusades begin there. The empire stretched, in theory, from the Balkans to the borders of Syria. In practice, the eastern half of that territory had been dissolving for 2 decades. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from the Central Asian steppe who had converted to Sunni Islam, had been pushing west since the mid-11th century, raiding deep into Anatolia and carving off provinces the Byzantines considered the heart of their military and agricultural base. The catastrophe arrived on a single day. On the 26th of August, 1071 AD, a Byzantine army met the Seljuks at a place called Manzikert, in the mountains of eastern Anatolia. The Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes commanded in person. He was experienced, capable, and he had assembled one of the largest armies the empire had fielded in a generation. By evening, the army was destroyed and the emperor was a prisoner, the first time a sitting Roman emperor had been captured alive by an enemy since the 3rd century. Alp Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, released Romanos after extracting an enormous ransom. But the damage was done. What followed Manzikert was, in some ways, worse than the battle itself. Romanos returned to Constantinople to find that his political enemies had already replaced him. Civil war broke out. The Seljuks, watching the chaos from the east, did not need to conquer Anatolia by force. They simply moved in. Independent Turkish warlords followed behind the retreating Byzantine frontier, settling the high plateau that had fed Constantinople for centuries. By 1080 AD, roughly 78,000 square kilometers of Anatolia that had been Byzantine were gone. The empire had not just lost a battle. It had lost the land that supplied its soldiers and its grain. The new emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, who seized power in 1081 AD, was a man of considerable ability operating in impossible conditions. He spent the first decade of his reign fighting on 4 fronts simultaneously. The Seljuks in the east, the Normans attacking from the west across the Adriatic, nomadic Pechenegs raiding from the north across the Danube, and constant court intrigue at home. He stabilized the empire through a combination of military discipline, diplomatic maneuver, and strategic marriage alliances. But he could not recover Anatolia. The territory was gone, and gone, he knew, permanently, unless he could find outside help. Turn now to the Islamic world, because it was the fractures there that made the First Crusade possible. Its Islam in 1095 AD was not one thing. It had not been one thing for over a century. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, which had once served as the spiritual and political center of the Sunni world, had been hollowed out from within. By the mid-10th century, a Shia dynasty called the Buyids had effectively taken control of Baghdad, keeping the Abbasid Caliph as a religious figurehead while holding all real power themselves. The Caliph issued proclamations. The Buyids held the army. In Cairo, a rival caliphate had existed since 969 AD. The Fatimids, an Ismaili Shia dynasty that claimed descent from the Prophet's daughter Fatima, and therefore a more legitimate line to lead all Islam. The Fatimids were not a peripheral force. At their height, they controlled Egypt, most of North Africa, Sicily, and the Levantine coast, including Jerusalem itself. From Baghdad's perspective, Cairo was not a distant competitor. It was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of Sunni Islam operating from the wealthiest city in the Mediterranean world. The hatred between the two caliphates was doctrinal, political, and absolute. The Seljuk Turks had resolved, at least temporarily, the problem in Baghdad. Arriving from the east in the 1050s AD, the Seljuks were Sunni converts who swept through Persia and took Baghdad in 1055 AD, expelling the Buyids and positioning themselves as the military arm of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Caliph remained, the Seljuks governed. But the Seljuks then pushed too far, too fast. By the 1090s AD, the Great Seljuk Empire was itself fracturing and splitting into competing principalities under rival Turkish commanders: the Seljuks of Rum and Anatolia, the Seljuks of Syria, the Seljuks of Iraq. Each one technically loyal to Baghdad, none of them cooperating. Syria and Palestine, the territories the Crusaders would march into, were in a condition of almost permanent civil war in the years before 1095 AD. The cities of Aleppo and Damascus were ruled by rival Turkish governors who regularly fought each other. Jerusalem had changed hands multiple times. The Fatimids had retaken it from the Seljuks in 1098 AD, just months before the Crusaders arrived. The idea that a unified Islamic world was waiting to repel a Christian invasion is a later invention. What was waiting was a patchwork of hostile city-states whose rulers were more concerned with each other than with any foreign force arriving from the West. Europe, the source of the Crusaders themselves, was its own particular kind of chaos. The continent in the late 11th century was not a collection of organized nations. It was a web of feudal obligations, hereditary claims, and localized power structures in which the line between political authority and private violence was, at best, blurry. A duke owed loyalty to a king, but the king's ability to enforce that loyalty depended on whether he could afford the soldiers to compel it. Land was power. Power required land, and younger sons inherited neither. The surplus of landless knights, trained for war, accustomed to violence, with no territory of their own, was one of the defining social tensions of the age. The papacy, in 1095 AD, was fighting its own battle for authority. For decades, popes and Holy Roman emperors had been locked in a dispute that went to the heart of how power was organized in the Christian West. The question was simple and deeply destabilizing: who had the right to appoint bishops? Bishops controlled vast landholdings and commanded political loyalty across the empire. Whoever appointed them controlled the machinery of governance. Pope Gregory VII had tried to settle the matter by asserting that only the Pope could invest church officials, and had excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV for defying him. Henry had famously stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa in 1077 AD, begging forgiveness. The humiliation was temporary, and the instability was not. Into this environment in the early 1090s AD came a letter. Emperor Alexios, watching his frontier dissolve and his treasury emptying, had sent word to Pope Urban II, his fellow Christian in Rome, whatever their ecclesiastical differences, asking for military assistance against the Turks. What Alexios wanted was mercenaries, a few thousand professional soldiers ideally to shore up his eastern borders and perhaps begin the slow work of recovering Anatolia. He appealed on religious grounds because he knew a religious appeal would travel further than a political one. He could not have known what he was about to set in motion. Urban II received the letter and saw in it something Alexios had not offered and did not intend. The Byzantine emperor wanted soldiers for hire, and Urban saw the possibility of something far larger, a war under papal command directed at the recovery of Jerusalem that would simultaneously unite the fractious nobility of Europe under a single religious purpose, extend papal authority over the military forces of Latin Christendom, and potentially heal the schism between the Roman and Byzantine churches that had officially split them apart in 1054 AD. A war of religion, properly framed, could solve more than a military problem. It could reorganize the political architecture of the Christian world. He began to plan his speech. Urban II was not a man given to impulsive decisions. Born into minor French nobility around 1035 AD, trained at the great monastery of Cluny, and shaped by decades of church reform politics, he understood power the way a craftsman understands tools, as something that requires the right moment, the right grip, and the right target. When Alexios's appeal arrived in early 1095 AD, Urban recognized immediately that it was all three at once. He began touring France, meeting bishops and nobles, building the architecture of something enormous. By November, he was ready. The Council of Clermont opened on the 18th of November, 1095 AD, in the Auvergne region of central France. It was formally a church council, a meeting to address the perennial business of ecclesiastical reform, simony, clerical celibacy, lay investiture, the peace of God. Urban worked through those items methodically over 9 days. They were the furniture of the meeting. The centerpiece came on the 27th of November, when Urban walked out into an open field outside the city walls, because no building in Clermont was large enough to hold the crowd that had gathered. What he said that day, we know only imperfectly. No official record of the speech survived. 5 accounts exist, all written years later, by men who had either attended or gathered their version from those who had. They differ in significant details. They agree on the essential structure. Urban spoke first of the violence tearing Europe apart, the lawlessness on the roads, the wars between Christian lords, the sword turned inward when it should face outward. He framed this not as a political complaint, but as a spiritual failure. European knights were wasting their violence on each other. There was a better use for it. He then described, in deliberately vivid terms, what was happening to Christians in the East. The churches of God in the eastern regions had been afflicted. The holy places were in the hands of those who did not know God. Jerusalem, the city glorified by the passion and resurrection of Christ, was held captive. Urban was careful in his actual letters, the ones we can verify, to speak of liberating the Eastern churches broadly, not Jerusalem specifically. But his listeners heard Jerusalem. They were primed to hear it. The city had been the destination of Christian pilgrimage for centuries, and pilgrims returning from the East brought back stories that Urban's audience already knew. The offer Urban placed before the crowd was unprecedented in the history of the church. Anyone who undertook the journey to aid the Eastern Christians, he declared, and who died either on the road or in battle, would receive remission of all their sins. Not partial remission, total remission. The slate wiped clean. This was the first recorded instance of a plenary indulgence being offered for a military campaign, and it fundamentally changed the relationship between violence and salvation in medieval Christian thought. A knight who had spent his life in sin could, in one journey, settle the entire account. The crowd's response, as recorded by Robert the Monk writing a decade later, was a single spontaneous cry. Deus vult. God wills it. Urban raised his hand for silence and told them that cry would be their battle call. Whether the response was truly spontaneous or whether Urban's speech had been precisely engineered to produce it is a question historians have argued ever since. The answer is probably both. Urban knew his audience. He had spent weeks meeting the nobility of France, taking the measure of their piety, their ambitions, their debts, their land hunger. The speech was a key cut to fit a specific lock. But what precisely was Urban's goal? Here, the history becomes genuinely complicated. In his own letters, the ones that survive, written in his own words rather than reconstructed by chroniclers, Urban consistently framed the enterprise as aid to the Eastern churches and the liberation of Christian pilgrimage routes, not the permanent military conquest of Jerusalem. He appointed Adhemar of Le Puy, a bishop, as the spiritual leader of the expedition, not a duke, not a king. He set the departure date as the 15th of August, 1096 AD, the Feast of the Assumption of Mary. The framing was deliberately religious, deliberately clerical. The papacy was to lead, and what the papacy led, the papacy controlled. Urban had a second audience in mind beyond the knights in the field at Clermont. Since 1088 AD, he had been fighting for his own legitimacy as pope. A rival claimant, the anti-pope Clement III, installed by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, still held Rome itself. Urban had governed the papacy largely from France and southern Italy, unable to safely enter his own capital. A successful holy war, launched under papal authority, prosecuted by the nobility of Latin Christendom, and concluded with the liberation of Jerusalem, would do more to settle the question of who led the Christian world than any amount of ecclesiastical debate. It would be, in the most literal sense, a demonstration of power. And the response to Urban's call exceeded anything he had prepared for. Within days of the speech, people were sewing crosses of red cloth onto their tunics, the symbol Urban had designated for those who took the vow. The cross was cut from garments and stitched on backs and shoulders. It spread outward from Clermont faster than any courier could carry the news, passed from village to village by the returning clergy who had been present. By the time Urban completed his tour of France in the spring of 1096 AD, the expedition he had envisioned as a controlled military force was in danger of becoming something else entirely. What Urban had called for was a disciplined army of knights and fighting men, departing in August 1096 AD under organized leadership. What began to move first was something he had not summoned and could not stop. Here across northern France and the Rhineland, a popular preacher named Peter the Hermit, a small, barefoot man of no formal rank, had been preaching his own version of the crusade to audiences of peasants, artisans, and minor knights with nothing to their names. He described Jerusalem with the authority of a man who had been there and seen it desecrated with his own eyes, whether or not this was true. Tens of thousands responded. They did not wait for August. Urban watched the popular movement gather momentum with something between alarm and incomprehension. These were not the soldiers he had in mind. They were hungry, poorly armed, moving with their families and their livestock through an early spring that had not yet turned the fields green. They had a destination, Jerusalem, and an enemy, the infidel. And that was roughly the extent of their military planning. They were moving east not as an army, but as a migration, and they carried with them a violence that had not been pointed carefully at a foreign enemy. It had simply been pointed. By the time Urban's carefully planned military expedition set out from France in August 1096 AD, 4 great armies under the command of Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Hugh of Vermandois. The people who had already departed were nearing catastrophe. The Pope's gamble had produced 2 very different things: the crusade he had designed and the crusade that had erupted out of it. Both were now moving east, and only one of them had any realistic hope of reaching Jerusalem. The people who answered Urban's call first were not the people he had asked for. He had imagined knights, armored, mounted, provisioned, answerable to lords who were answerable to him. What gathered in the spring of 1096 AD was something far older and stranger, a mass movement of ordinary men and women who had heard the word Jerusalem and decided, with very little else by way of a plan, that they were going. The crops had been poor, the roads were dangerous, the end of the world felt near. And a man called Peter the Hermit was telling anyone who would listen that God himself was leading them east. Peter was a French priest, small and lean, who rode a donkey and wore the same rough tunic for the length of his journey. He had probably been to Jerusalem before, and whether or not his account of its desecration was precisely accurate, and his audiences believed every word of it. He moved through the villages of northern France and the Rhineland in early 1096 AD, drawing crowds that grew with every stop. People said that animals followed him on the road out of reverence. He carried a letter, he told his listeners, from heaven itself. Some of what he was teaching was Urban's message, some of it was his own. All of it worked. The peasants who joined Peter did not think of themselves as a rabble. They thought of themselves as God's poor, the meek who would, as Scripture promised, inherit the earth, or at minimum inherit Jerusalem. They sold what they had, left their fields, and joined the column. A woman strapped her children to a cart. A blacksmith left his forge cold. An old man with no fighting experience whatsoever fell in behind the procession because the alternative was to stay home and watch the world end without him. Estimates of the People's Crusade at its height range from 40,000 to as many as 100,000, an enormous, barely armed, hungry migration moving east at walking pace. The journey broke almost immediately. The column needed to eat, and it moved through a landscape that had not been warned of its arrival. When local markets refused to sell or demanded prices beyond what the pilgrims could pay, they took what they needed. Towns along the Danube, Zemun, Belgrade, Sofia, were pillaged and burned. At Zemun, a dispute over the price of a pair of shoes in the market escalated into a full assault on the town in which 4,000 Hungarians were killed. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios, who had asked for soldiers and been sent a catastrophe, watched the column approach Constantinople with something close to dread. He rushed food to them, got them across the Bosphorus as fast as possible, and begged them to wait for the proper armies to arrive. They did not wait. They were not built for waiting. Within weeks of arriving on the Asiatic shore, the column had split apart. French and German factions moving in different directions, raiding the countryside around Nicaea, looting villages belonging to Greek Christians as readily as Muslim ones. A German detachment captured a small Seljuk fortress called Zaragordan, held it briefly, and was besieged and destroyed when the Turks cut off the water supply. The survivors who were not killed converted to Islam to stay alive. The main body of the army, hearing rumors that Zaragordan had fallen and that Nicaea itself was ripe for plunder, decided to march immediately over the objections of every voice of caution remaining. 3 miles from their camp at Civito, the road entered a narrow wooded valley near a village called Draken. The Seljuk army of Kilij Arslan was already there, waiting in silence in the trees. The People's Crusade marched noisily into the valley, talking, praying, completely unprepared, and walked directly into a wall of arrows. Panic set in within minutes. The army collapsed into a rout. The vulnerable non-combatants and families who had made it all the way from France were tragically lost in the camp behind. The battle on the 21st of October 1096 AD was over in an afternoon. It is possible that more people died at Civito in a single day than Urban had intended to send on the entire crusade. Peter the Hermit was not there. He had gone back to Constantinople to negotiate supplies and was absent when his army was destroyed. He survived, wintered in Constantinople among the fragments of what had followed him from France, and eventually attached himself to the arriving armies of the official crusade in a lesser role. The man whose preaching had set tens of thousands in motion ended the campaign as a footnote to the enterprise he had launched. History has not been entirely sure what to make of him. His followers made the decision to move without him, but they moved as he had taught them to move, on faith without caution into a world for which nothing had prepared them. Before the column reached Anatolia, it had left a different kind of destruction behind it in Europe. In the spring of 1096 AD, as the People's Crusade moved through the Rhineland, the Jewish communities of the Rhine Valley were attacked. The reasoning, such as it was, ran as follows. The crusade had been called against the enemies of Christ. The Jews had killed Christ. Why march thousands of miles to fight the enemy of God when the enemy of God was living in the next street? This logic was not endorsed by the church, nor by most of the nobility. The bishops of Speyer and Cologne actively protected the Jewish communities in their cities. It did not always work. In May 1096 AD, a count named Emico of Flunheim led a force through the Rhine cities with a specific program of killing and forced conversion. At Speyer, 12 Jews were murdered before the bishop intervened. At Worms, the bishop sheltered hundreds of Jews inside his palace, and then the gates were broken open. Around 800 people died at Worms. At Mainz, more than 1,000 were killed. Jewish families who could not escape and refused conversion chose to perish on their own terms rather than be taken. The Hebrew Chronicles describe the devastating final moments of these families before the end came. Those records survive because communities reconstituted themselves afterwards and made sure the memory did not disappear. Emico believed, according to a 12th century Jewish chronicle, that Jesus himself had appeared to him and promised him a crown in Jerusalem once the Jews were dealt with. He never reached Jerusalem. After his campaign of killing along the Rhine, he marched his force into Hungary, and the Hungarian king, disgusted by the violence his army had inflicted on the countryside, destroyed it. Emico turned around and went home. The apocalypse he had been promised did not come. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland had been devastated for nothing, not even from the Crusade's own terrible perspective. The People's Crusade was a catastrophe, but it was not a meaningless one. It established several things that the official crusade would have to reckon with. First, that the route through the Balkans was viable. The French contingent under Walter Sans-Avoir had moved through Hungary and into Byzantine territory without incident. Second, that Alexios could not simply direct this movement as he had hoped. The people coming from the west were following their own logic, not his. Third, and most importantly, is that the Seljuk Turks were formidably capable fighters who had now seen the caliber of the force moving towards them. Kili Arslan, having destroyed Peter's army at Civito, concluded that the western threat had been dealt with. He turned his attention back to his eastern rivals. He would not make that mistake again for long. A few thousand survivors, the remnant pulled from the castle at Civito by a Byzantine naval force, were in Constantinople when the official crusade arrived in the winter of 1096 AD. Some of them joined the proper armies and eventually reached Jerusalem. They were the only ones of the tens of thousands who had set out from France in the spring to do so. Peter the Hermit walked into the Holy City in 1099 AD. He had lasted the whole terrible length of it, from the first sermon to the end. He outlived almost everyone who had followed him and died in 1115 AD back in Europe at a monastery he had founded. A quiet end for a man who had set the world briefly on fire. The armies that assembled outside Constantinople between November 1096 AD and April 1097 AD were unlike anything the Byzantine court had seen in living memory. 4 great contingents had come by different roads: Raymond of Toulouse and the southern French from the west, Godfrey of Bouillon and his brothers from Lorraine, Bohemond of Taranto and his Norman knights from southern Italy, and a northern French force under Robert of Normandy and others. Together, including camp followers, servants, priests, pilgrims, and non-combatants, they probably numbered close to 100,000 people. They were hungry, suspicious of each other, and imperfectly in agreement about what exactly they were there to do. Emperor Alexios received them with lavish hospitality and an iron determination to get them across the Bosphorus as quickly as possible. Alexios extracted something from every leader before they crossed, an oath of fealty swearing that any former Byzantine territory they recovered would be returned to the empire. Some of the crusade leaders gave the oath willingly. Some resisted, then relented. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman who had previously campaigned against the Byzantines and knew exactly what he was agreeing to, gave the oath with a smile that the Byzantine princess Anna Komnene, writing decades later, described as concealing calculation. The oath was made in earnest by some and as a formality by others, and the ambiguity would matter later. But for now, the armies crossed the Bosphorus and began moving southeast into Anatolia, into territory the Seljuks believed they owned. The first serious obstacle was Nicaea, the former Byzantine city now serving as the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, held by Kili Arslan, the same commander who had destroyed Peter the Hermit's army at Civito. Kili Arslan was away campaigning when the Crusaders arrived and laid siege to Nicaea in May 1097 AD. He rushed back, attacked the Crusader lines, was repulsed, and watched from a distance as the Crusaders besieged a city he could not relieve. Alexios, meanwhile, conducting his own diplomacy directly with the city's garrison, arranged for the city to surrender quietly to Byzantine forces, sparing it the sack the Crusaders had been hoping for and expecting. Now, the Crusaders woke one morning to find Byzantine banners flying over the walls and Nicaea already gone. Several of the Norman and French commanders had to be diplomatically restrained from forcing the issue. After Nicaea, the march south towards Jerusalem settled into a rhythm of exhaustion and intermittent violence. The land was hot and dry, and the supply lines from the coast were unreliable. At Dorylaeum in early July 1097 AD, Kili Arslan ambushed the vanguard of the army with a large cavalry force. Light Turkish horse archers who circled and shot and refused to close for the kind of massed battle the crusading knights were trained for. The vanguard under Bohemond held its formations under a hail of arrows for hours, taking casualties it could not replace, waiting for the main force to arrive. When Godfrey and the others came up and the full army charged, the Turks scattered. It was the first major field victory of the crusade, and it taught the Frankish commanders something crucial. The Turkish horse archer could not be ridden down if he simply refused to stand, but he could be broken if the Crusader army held its nerve and kept its formation until the moment of decision. The march through Anatolia was grinding. The army moved through a landscape stripped bare by the retreating Turks. Wells poisoned, crops burned, villages emptied. Men died of thirst. Horses collapsed and were eaten. The column stretched for miles, and its flanks were constantly probed by Turkish riders who vanished when charged and returned when the column moved on. By the time the army reached northern Syria in the autumn of 1097 AD, it was significantly smaller than it had been at Nicaea, and it was staring at the walls of Antioch, a city of extraordinary fortification perched above a river with walls that ran for miles across the surrounding hills. The siege of Antioch lasted 8 months, from October 1097 AD to June 1098 AD, and it nearly destroyed the crusade from within before any Turkish army managed it from without. The Crusaders could not fully encircle the city. It was simply too large, so Antioch stayed partially supplied while the besiegers slowly starved outside its walls. Famine struck the camp in the winter. Chroniclers record men eating their horses, their dogs, the boiled leather of their shields, and grain scraped from dried animal dung. 1 in 5 Crusaders probably died of starvation during the siege. Men deserted. Stephen of Blois, now one of the most senior commanders, quietly slipped away and went home to France. Peter the Hermit himself tried to desert and was dragged back. What broke the siege was not military genius, but betrayal and providence in roughly equal measure. Bohemond had been quietly cultivating a contact inside the city, a garrison officer named Firuz, an Armenian Christian who controlled the Tower of the Two Sisters. Firuz's motives are unclear. He was probably resentful of his commanders, possibly bribed, possibly genuinely sympathetic to the crusade. Whatever his reasons, on the night of the 2nd of June 1098 AD, he opened the tower to Bohemond's men. The crusaders poured in, seized the lower city, and slaughtered the Turkish garrison. The governor, Yagi Sian, fled through a small gate and died in the hills, in falling from his horse in grief and exhaustion, unable to sit upright. His son held the citadel. And then, 2 days later, an enormous Seljuk relief army under Kerboga of Mosul arrived outside the walls. The besiegers had just become the besieged. The situation inside Antioch in June 1098 AD was close to catastrophe. The Crusaders held the lower city, but not the citadel, which Kerboga's forces could resupply and reinforce from the walls above. Kerboga surrounded the city. Food ran out again almost immediately. Men who had survived one famine began to starve inside the very city they had starved to capture. It was at this point that a peasant named Peter Bartholomew came forward and reported a vision. St. Andrew had shown him where the Holy Lance was buried, the spear that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion, directly beneath the floor of the cathedral. The leaders were skeptical. Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, thought the whole thing was suspicious. But the army was desperate, and when they dug and found what appeared to be a lance head, the effect on morale was immediate and overwhelming. On the 28th of June, 1098 AD, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch to meet Kerboga in open battle. They were gaunt, undersupplied, and outnumbered. They carried the Holy Lance at their head. Kerboga's army was large but politically fractured. Several of his allied commanders had already begun to doubt his leadership. And when the Crusader charge drove into the center of his line, rather than hold and destroy the starving enemy in front of them, significant portions of the Muslim force began to pull back. What started as a controlled withdrawal became a rout. Kerboga fled. His army disintegrated. The Crusaders stood on a battlefield they had no rational expectation of winning and struggled to believe what had happened. Many of them concluded that God had intervened directly. History offers no cleaner alternative explanation for the outcome, which made the defeat of a large, well-supplied army by an exhausted, starving one seem simply improbable. After Antioch, the crusades stalled. Itamar of Le Puy, the one man capable of mediating between the ego-driven princes, died of typhus in August 1098 AD. Bohemond announced that he was keeping Antioch for himself in violation of his oath to Alexios. Raymond of Toulouse, who had argued that the city should be returned to Byzantium, was furious and refused to leave. The crusade sat at Antioch for months while its leaders disputed territory that was not yet secure and threatened the unity of an army that had no margin for disunity. It was the rank-and-file crusaders, the knights and infantry with no stake in the political quarrel, who finally forced the issue, threatening to tear down the walls of Antioch themselves if the leaders would not move on. In January 1099 AD, the march resumed. Jerusalem in June 1099 AD was held by the Fatimid Caliphate, which had retaken it from the Seljuks only the previous year. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, and had expelled the Christian population from the city, poisoned the wells outside the walls, driven off the livestock, and cut down every tree within range, so the Crusaders could not build siege equipment. The Crusaders arrived at the walls on the 7th of June, sunburned, footsore, and without enough wood to construct the towers they needed. Genoese ships at the port of Jaffa eventually provided the timber. The towers took weeks to build under constant fire from the walls. Water was rationed. The heat was extreme. The army walked barefoot around the walls in a religious procession, singing, watched by the Fatimid garrison above. On the 15th of July, 1099 AD, Godfrey of Bouillon's men pushed a siege tower against the northern wall of Jerusalem. A drawbridge was lowered. Men crossed onto the battlements. The defenses collapsed inward. A crusader named Ludolf of Tournai was the first onto the wall. Within hours, the Frankish army was inside the city, and what followed is described in identical terms by eyewitnesses on both sides: a massacre. The Muslim population was killed or enslaved. The Jewish community, which had fought alongside the defenders, retreated to their synagogue, and the building was set on fire. The violence completely overwhelmed the city. The crusaders who wept were weeping for joy. Godfrey of Bouillon refused to be crowned king of Jerusalem. He would not, he said, wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He accepted instead the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre and ruled for exactly 1 year before dying of illness. 3 weeks later, on the 12th of August, 1099 AD, a large Fatimid relief army under the Vizier al-Afdal arrived at Ascalon on the coast, intending to retake Jerusalem. The Crusaders surprised them before they could organize, and the Egyptians broke and fled, the vizier escaping by sea. It was the last military action of the First Crusade. Almost immediately, the majority of the crusading army, their vows fulfilled, their Jerusalem won, turned around and went home to France and Normandy and Lorraine. They left behind a few hundred knights to garrison a city of enormous religious significance that was surrounded on all sides by powers that had not yet begun to seriously respond to what had just happened. The miracle was real. So was the fragility of everything that followed it. Urban II died on the 29th of July, 1099 AD, 14 days after Jerusalem fell, and the news of the city's capture had not yet reached Rome. He never knew his crusade had succeeded. The man who had set the whole enterprise in motion, who had planned his speech in a field in Clermont, had offered the remission of sins in exchange for a march to the east, had watched the movement he created grow beyond anything he had imagined, died without learning the outcome. It is one of the quieter ironies of a story that has very few quiet moments. The 4 Crusader states that emerged from the First Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli, are almost always described as alien intrusions. A thin Christian crust imposed on a resistant Muslim landscape. This picture is wrong in almost every important detail. The Franks, as the Crusaders were universally called by the peoples of the East, were a minority from the first day. They governed through a combination of feudal law, pragmatic accommodation, and sheer necessity. And what they built over the following century was something no popular history of the Crusades has adequately reckoned with. A genuinely plural society, imperfect and often violent, but far more complex than the Holy War narrative allows. The population they ruled was not predominantly Muslim. When the Crusaders arrived in the Levant at the end of the 11th century, the Holy Land was still at least half Christian: Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Jacobite, Maronite, Coptic, and Nestorian communities whose presence in the region predated Islam by centuries. There were also Jewish communities of considerable antiquity in the cities and countryside. Muslims were concentrated in specific rural areas, particularly the plains of Galilee and the southern interior, and were probably a minority of the total population across most of the Crusader territories. The Franks did not arrive into an Islamic world. They arrived into a world of plural faiths in which Islam was one of several competing presences. The first generation of Frankish rulers recognized very quickly that they could not govern this landscape with the few hundred knights who had stayed after the First Crusade. Almost every crusader who had fulfilled his vow went home. William of Tyre, writing in the 12th century, He records that barely 300 knights and 2,000 foot soldiers remained in the entire kingdom of Jerusalem in 1100 AD. To hold a territory of this scale against enemies on multiple fronts, the Frankish lords needed the cooperation of the local population, which meant leaving local governance largely intact. Muslim villages in the countryside continued to be administered by their own elders and religious leaders. Local disputes within the Muslim community were handled according to their own customs. Local Christian communities continued to be governed by their own patriarchs and bishops. The Franks sat above this structure and extracted taxation from it. They did not, in most cases, dismantle it. The taxes the Crusaders imposed on their Muslim subjects were, by the standards of the time, modest, and were in most cases lower than the taxes those same peasants had paid under Seljuk rule. The Spanish-born Muslim traveler Ibn Jubair passed through the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1183 AD and noted, with evident irritation, that the Muslim peasants of Galilee appeared more prosperous and more content than those living under Islamic rule across the border. He expected to find oppressed subjects. What he found was a functioning agricultural economy whose inhabitants expected, as he recorded, justice from their Frankish landlords. He was reporting something real. The Crusader states invested heavily in roads, mills, and irrigation. The ports of Acre and Tyre became among the most commercially active in the eastern Mediterranean. The Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, had helped transport the crusade to the Holy Land and had been rewarded with commercial quarters in the coastal cities. Through those quarters ran a trade that connected Europe to the products of Asia. Spices from the east, sugar from the Syrian hinterland, silk, dyes, glass. Muslim merchants traded with Frankish merchants in the market courts of Acre. Jewish moneylenders and accountants served both sides. Greek and Armenian interpreters moved between cultures as a matter of daily professional life. The Crusader states were, among other things, an economic experiment, an attempt to extract revenue from the intersection of the Christian and Islamic worlds. And for long stretches of the 12th century, it worked. The Frankish settlers themselves changed. Within a single generation, the children of Norman and French knights were speaking Arabic, eating local food, dressing in local styles, and marrying into Armenian and local Christian families. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, writing around 1124 AD, recorded the transformation with something like wonder. Men who had come from the West as Occidentals had been made, he wrote, into Orientals. They bathed, which their European contemporaries mocked. They wore silk. They kept Syrian physicians. They prayed in churches built in an architectural style that blended French Romanesque with Arab and Byzantine forms. The older Crusaders who remained identified increasingly as native, as men of Outremer, the world beyond the sea, which was their world now, and not a posting. So the evidence for this daily coexistence comes from an unlikely source. A Syrian nobleman named Usama ibn Munkidh, born in 1095 AD in the castle of Shazar on the Orontes River. The same year Urban II preached the First Crusade. Usama lived 93 years, served the Fatimids, the Zengids, and the Ayyubids, fought the Crusaders in battle, and also counted several Frankish knights among his close personal friends. His memoir, written at the end of his long life, is the most vivid account we have of how the two worlds encountered each other at the human level. He describes dining with Frankish lords who served him food cooked to his dietary requirements. He describes a Templar knight who cleared a small mosque in Jerusalem so that Usama could pray there in private. Now, he describes also the bewildering hostility of newly arrived Crusaders who had not yet learned that the world they had come to was not the world they had imagined. Usama's memoir catches the distinction that defined life in Outremer. The difference between the Franks who had lived there a long time and those freshly arrived from Europe. The long-settled Franks had absorbed the customs of the East. They were, in his view, almost comprehensible. The newcomers were dangerous, not because they were enemies, but because they had arrived with Europe's categories intact, and Europe's categories did not fit. A freshly arrived crusader once rushed at Usama while he was praying in a small mosque beside the Al-Aqsa and tried to force him to face east, towards the Christian Jerusalem, rather than south toward Mecca. The Templars apologized and removed the man. They knew better. He did not. This gap between those who understood Outremer and those who had just arrived to save it was a structural tension that the Crusader states never fully resolved. The military orders, the Knights Templar, founded around 1119 AD, and the Knights Hospitaller, whose origins lay in a hospital for pilgrims in Jerusalem, became, over the 12th century, the permanent professional military backbone of the Crusader states. Unlike the knights who came on crusade and went home, the Templars and Hospitallers stayed. They built and garrisoned the great castles of the Levant, Crac de Chevalier in the county of Tripoli, the Templar fortress at Tortosa, the Hospitaller stronghold at Belvoir. They conducted their own diplomacy, their own banking, yes, their own intelligence networks. They were, in many respects, states within states, answerable primarily to the Pope rather than to the Crusader kings, and their relationship with the secular rulers of Jerusalem was sometimes cooperative, often competitive, and occasionally corrosive. The political structure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was, by the standards of its time, unusually constitutional. The king governed alongside a high court of barons who held genuine legislative and judicial power. No major decision, war, taxation, major appointments could be made without their consent. The Assizes of Jerusalem, the kingdom's legal code, outlined these rights and responsibilities in detail. When a weak or incompetent king attempted to override the barons, the high court pushed back. This was not democracy in any modern sense. It was a feudal oligarchy, but it produced in practice a governing system that was more collectively accountable than most contemporary European monarchies, and it meant that the survival of the kingdom depended not on the quality of any single ruler, but on the resilience of its institutional structure. That structure was tested constantly by the fundamental demographic problem the Crusader states never solved. They were always too few. The Frankish population in the Kingdom of Jerusalem at its 12th century peak has been estimated at around 120,000, a minority ruling a total population of perhaps 750,000. Every substantial military engagement drained a pool of trained fighters that could not easily be replenished. Replacements came from Europe in irregular waves, mostly young men from noble families seeking land, adventure, or spiritual credit, who frequently arrived with ideas about how to deal with the Muslims that the settled Franks found counterproductive and dangerous. The kingdom needed fresh soldiers from the West. It also, repeatedly, needed those soldiers to stop treating its Muslim subjects as enemies to be converted or expelled. The Crusader states were not innocent. The legal structure that governed them was racially stratified. Franks held all positions of real authority, and native populations, even native Christians, operated in a subordinate tier. Jews remained marginalized and periodically persecuted. The violence of conquest that had brought the states into existence did not disappear. It was simply institutionalized. Muslims in the Crusader states were exempt from military service, yes, but they paid higher taxes than their Christian neighbors and had no access to the upper echelons of governance. By the standards of the 21st century, Outremer was a colonial society. By the standards of the 12th century, it was, in certain measurable respects, a more tolerant place to live than the territories surrounding it, which is a complicated thing to say and worth saying carefully. The world Fulcher of Chartres described in 1124 AD, "Men become Orientals, a new people made from the meeting of two," did not survive. It was too small, too isolated, too dependent on a stream of replenishment from a Europe that was always half distracted and never fully committed. But while it lasted, it produced something genuine. A society in which a Syrian Muslim nobleman could sit down to dinner with a Norman knight, not argue about medicine and theology and hunting and warfare, find the knight personally admirable and culturally baffling, and call him, as Usama ibn Munkid did of one particular Frankish friend, a brother. That word was not a diplomatic formality. It was what the word meant, and it tells us something about the Crusader states that neither the defenders nor the critics of the crusading enterprise had been entirely willing to acknowledge. The society that Usama observed and participated in and wrote about was already under pressure when he set down his memoirs in old age. The fragmented Islamic world that had allowed the Crusader states to exist as buffer zones between competing powers was slowly, and then suddenly, beginning to change. A new kind of Muslim political ambition was taking shape in the north, built around a different kind of ruler with a different kind of project. The Crusader states had survived because no single Muslim power had been willing or able to unite against them. That calculation was about to shift. For roughly the first 4 decades of the Crusader presence in the Levant, the Islamic world responded with something close to indifference. This is not the story most people know, but it is what happened. When Jerusalem fell in 1099 AD, Muslim chroniclers noted the event and moved on. The city mattered deeply in theology. It was the site of the Prophet's night journey and ascension. But in the immediate political calculus of the fractured Islamic world of the early 12th century, a Frankish-held Jerusalem was one problem among many, and not necessarily the most pressing. The Seljuks of Syria and Iraq were fighting each other. The Fatimids of Egypt were managing their own crises. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was a ceremonial institution. Nobody was in a position to mount a serious counteroffensive, and nobody was certain it was their particular responsibility to do so. The Crusader states survived their first generation primarily because of this absence of unified opposition. Frankish lords understood this clearly enough. The king of Jerusalem's chief strategic concern in the early 12th century was not any single Muslim power, but the possibility that any one of the rival Muslim powers might stop fighting each other long enough to cooperate against him. The rivalry between Damascus and Aleppo was, from Jerusalem's perspective, a gift, and so was the hostility between the Sunni powers of Syria and the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo. As long as Islam remained a geography of competing ambitions, the thin line of Frankish castles along the Levantine coast had room to breathe. The man who began to change this was not, on the surface, a natural candidate for holy war. Imad ad-Din Zengi was the Turkic Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, a military governor of enormous ambition and considerable brutality, described by chroniclers on both sides as a man of fierce temper, who was equally capable of executing a subordinate for insubordination and forging a pragmatic alliance with a Crusader lord if it served his immediate interests. He spent more of his career fighting other Muslim rulers than fighting the Franks. He made truces with the Kingdom of Jerusalem when it suited him. He was not, by any honest measure, a pious man or a principled jihadist. What he was a supremely effective consolidator of power. When Zengi besieged and captured the city of Edessa on Christmas Eve, 1144 AD, the first major Crusader state to fall, the Muslim world celebrated with something approaching disbelief. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad named him the Sword of the Faithful. Poets composed panegyrics. The event was described as a victory of victories. For 45 years, the Frankish states had seemed immovable. Zengi had just proved they were not. He had done it, characteristically, for primarily political reasons. Jocelyn II of Edessa had made an alliance with Zengi's Muslim rivals and had marched his army east to assist them, leaving the city exposed. Zengi saw an opportunity, and took it. The rhetoric of jihad followed the victory rather than preceding it. But the rhetoric mattered. It gave the capture of Edessa a meaning that transcended